All right, everybody. Today's the day. How are you feeling? I know a lot of people are very stressed and anxious. I understand it in a way. This is a quadrennial event. A lot of people have a lot of emotions and passions, I guess you would say, vested in the election. I mean, we spend a preposterous amount of time in the United States on our presidential election cycles. I mean, you can even make an argument that they never really end because what would even be marked as the beginning point of a presidential campaign? It's not clear. The candidates who consider running for the party's nominations generally start that process well before there's any primary that's going to take place. As I mentioned, sort of offhandedly on Twitter yesterday, I remember fighting about Beto as the supposed front runner for the Democratic nomination, December of 2018. And you can even go back further than that in terms of the machinations that the candidates have to put into effect to prepare for the launch of their candidacies. And it's almost without parallel in the developed world that we spend so incredibly long in the throes of these campaign cycles. But today it shall culminate, and the question that I'm asked the most, and I'm sure many of you have been asked this, and maybe have even asked it of others, is who's going to win? Like, that's all people want to know. Well, I don't have a crystal ball, but I can give you some intuitions that are going to be admittedly imperfect, but I don't get into this game of offering ironclad predictions, and then if I'm wrong, I incur no consequences. I mean, it's so lame. And you see so many people who can go to the nifty little 270 to win website, fill in their little electoral map, which is based almost entirely on just what they perceive as the polling data. And then they can claim that there is some kind of incredible oracle as to the inner secrets of U.S. politics. I find the exercise very tedious, so I don't do that. But I do give some intuitions and some general themes as to how I'm perceiving what's going to happen with the election. And I did the same in 2016. In 2016, just by contrast, what I perceived at the time was a whole lot of volatility. And I've mentioned this on the YouTube stream before and in various other formats. But there's a lot of volatility. People were making up their minds relatively late. Partly that was a function of both Trump and Hillary Clinton being uniquely despised candidates, meaning that their favorability ratings were historically low. And Trump was still an open question as to how he would govern. Nobody like that had ever gotten the nomination of a major party before, much less become president. So it was almost a roll of the dice in a way that I think certain people who were disaffected from the political system might have found appealing or intriguing. Now, with 4 years of Trump in office, that level of mystery or intrigue, I think, is very much diminished. That's not to say that Trump doesn't have a virulent base of support. He most certainly does. I was in Rome, Georgia, Sunday night for one of his final rallies, and I arrived 4 hours, maybe even over 4 hours before Trump actually spoke, thinking that that would be more than enough time to be able to get in. And I didn't go through the media entrance. If I go to these events, generally I like to do what the general public does, with select few exceptions if it's absolutely needed for me to request a media credential. And I ended up waiting online for just an absurd amount of time, barely got in only after he had begun speaking, and was able to see maybe the final half or third of his comments. Um, and I can verify that I would say slightly, when I say there's idolatry around Trump, it's not even necessarily a pejorative. It's just a fact. I mean, there is a huge amount. And all you have to do is go to one of these rallies to see that idolatrous reverence on full display. And so I think, maybe there's a chance here that our intuitions, gleaned largely from the polling data, are going to be incorrect. And we've underestimated the amount of new Trump voters. So Trump can't win if he just carries over the coalition he had in 2016. I don't think. I think he would have had to broaden his electorate. And I've always had the sense, based on the totality of data that one can consume in evaluating American political events, that he hadn't broadened that coalition over the course of his first term in office sufficient to achieve re-election. He had hardened his supporters, and that's for sure. But I just don't know if I have seen enough in the way of new support for Trump that could carry him over the finish line. And I could be wrong. My intuitions have been wrong before. Biden is almost comical in the absence of specific drive to vote for him that you can go and see if you travel around the country. Like, I don't think I've spoken to a fair amount of voters at this point, just in the random states that I've gone to, not random, but quote unquote swing states, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and now Georgia. And I haven't heard anybody who voluntarily stated that they have any kind of enthusiastic pro-Biden preference. It's almost universally an anti-Trump preference. And I think that if Biden were to win, then it really would upend a lot of assumptions about what is required to win the presidency, because apparently you don't need any kind of significant personal charisma or enthusiasm that's affirmative for you. You just need to be up against somebody who stokes such fervor, both pro and against, and which Trump most certainly does. And that said, I always leave open the possibility that my intuitions are entirely wrong. So that's why I don't make these ironclad predictions, because they're stupid. If somebody tells you that they know with 100% certainty what's going to happen in Pennsylvania, how do you know that? It's impossible. So, like I said, I'm in Georgia today. I've been in Georgia for the past, 4 or 5 days. And I had thought about going to Florida for election day, but decided to actually stay in Georgia because, to me, it's in a way more interesting in the following sense: that Florida is almost always just assumed to be a highly contentious, quote, swing state where the margins are razor thin, clearly stemming back to 2000. And the outcome in Florida has coincided with the outcome overall since 2000, maybe going back further. I don't know off the top of my head. But to me, Georgia is a little bit more interesting, because if what we're told is happening here is true, which is a big if, I'll grant. But if it is actually a bigger swing state, or if it is a new swing state, meaning Georgia and Florida have sort of merged in their partisan makeup, then to have a new swing state like that burst onto the scene is interesting. And now, Hillary supposedly did contest Georgia last time, but everybody, I think, was largely, at least I was, heavily skeptical that was a rational choice on her part. Now I'm not so sure about Georgia. Um, and again, it's anecdotal, it's experiential, it's probably muddled by my own confirmation bias, which everybody cannot never be fully cognizant of. But I do get the sense that Georgia, given the resources that have been poured in here, I was speaking to people who have said that they never saw anything like the mobilization in Georgia, particularly on the Democratic side. Georgia, and if Georgia is suddenly a new swing state, as evidenced by the fact that Trump would go out of his way to come here on Sunday. I mean, why would he have done that if he didn't feel that it was actually at least potentially going to be close? Tells you there is some sort of shift potentially in the makings. And if the Republicans had been operating under the assumption until relatively recently that this was a solid Trump state, then I think it's possible that they may not have. They may be outmatched by the Democrats in terms of just the get out the vote resources and such. And of course, all this is barring any issues that may arise around election administration with the mass conversion to mail-in voting. I'm almost certain that there will be claims of fraud. Whether they're widespread enough to actually disrupt the election, the calling of the outcome, I tend to doubt. But nonetheless, I did think it was worthwhile to be here in Georgia. So shortly after I finish this video and leave my temporary dwelling here, I'll be going around to polling sites, just trying to take the temperature of stuff. Again, I'm not somebody who brands myself as this all-knowing font of wisdom as to election outcomes. I find that to be almost always very self-serving. But I can gather as much experiential data as I can and give you my impressions, and that's what I've always done. I did that in Pennsylvania last week. So if you haven't seen my piece from Pennsylvania, it's linked in the description box. And it relates to the, again, bizarre story of the whole Biden campaign here, which is not in any sense a traditional campaign in that they have secret privatized events. And I understand the coronavirus rationale for that. And I don't necessarily even doubt that there is a sound epidemiological justification for it. But even when you talk to committed hardcore Democrats, like volunteers, people spending a lot of time working to elect Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, they have confided to me that they are frustrated by the amazing secrecy around something so simple as where to go if you'd like to see the presidential or vice presidential nominees if they are coming to campaign in your immediate area. Like, as I posted from that video on Sunday afternoon, Kamala Harris was in Gwinnett County on Sunday, and unless you had special connections, unless you had people texting you who got tipped off from the sorority listservs that they're on, because apparently Kamala Harris's college sorority has like an information network where you can get inside information on her travels. Or unless you're connected to the Democratic Party, have some other inside information, you can't go to one of these events. So they're reserved for donors. They're reserved for party officials. They're reserved for people who are in the know. And I don't buy that the semi-privatization of campaign events, for the first time essentially ever, is justified purely on the grounds of COVID. Can you take precautions? Sure. Are there distancing measures and such that could be in place while still allowing the general public to come, at least in some numbers, if they so choose? I think that would have been possible. And I think that the decision on the part of the Biden campaign to be so hyper secretive, almost without parallel in U.S. history, is indicative of something beyond their commitment to containing the virus. Now, I'm not saying that it won't be successful. Biden may win in spite of it. But at the very least, what it will be is a test of the notion that observable in-person enthusiasm is a significant determinator of who wins a national election, because there's very little of anything that looks like pro-Biden sentiment on public display. And whereas if you go to a Trump rally, as I did, it's like a blowout event. And if I wouldn't be consistent if I didn't know that those Trump rallies do seem to me to have the potential to be virus spreading events. And maybe you don't care about that. Maybe you maligned the protesters over the summer for doing that, despite not actually caring on principle if the virus were spread. But I've tried to at least maintain some consistency in how I view that issue. And these are mass gatherings where I even heard somebody in line at the Trump event in Rome, Georgia, laughing and saying, haha, I think we're super spreaders here. And she was only half kidding. The Trump campaign, actually, if you get their emails telling you how to, after you quote unquote register for these events, which is not really necessary in the first place, it's just a data collecting operation. But I did it just to kind of see what the process was and what the guidelines were. And you get an email advising you, asking you in unambiguous terms to please wear a mask for the entirety of the event, and that there will be hand sanitizer and additional masks on display. Well, I waited online for I don't know how many hours, ended up getting in, was pretty close to Trump, and not once was I approached with a complimentary mask or hand sanitizer. So I just have to put that out there. I think if Trump does lose, one of the explanations with some merit will be his attitude and his campaign's attitude around COVID being contrary to what the majority of the public feel about the severity of COVID and the need to contain it. So don't blame me for being the bearer of bad news if you're a Trump supporter. That's probably going to be borne out in the election results, should it go in an anti-Trump direction, which is, again, nowhere near established yet. But on another note, I did write a second piece that I self-published yesterday at Medium, which is also linked in the description box, on the theme of who wins if Trump loses. That's the title. Now, obviously, literally who wins is going to be Joe Biden. We know that. I'm asking a bit of a deeper question as to what factions that have been hyper prevalent in American political culture over the past 4 years are going to rightfully claim vindication if they achieve what has been their monomaniacal goal of the past 4 years, deposing Trump. If they do successfully do that, who's going to be vindicated? Well, it's going to be the people who pioneered a new tactic of constant inducements of hysteria, panic, irrationality, complicity with the security state apparatus to achieve short-term political goals, which they excused and justified because it happened to be to the detriment of Trump these past 4 years for the most part. But it may not be that way in the future. I would predict in the long-term future, it's definitely not going to always be that way. Russiagate, impeachment, the nonstop waves of interminable moral panic that were weaponized to undermine Trump, all that's going to be vindicated. All that's going to be confirmed to have been effective tactics in the minds of those who are practitioners of them. And it's going to be hard to argue if it turns out that it did contribute to the defeat of Trump. And so I think one thing that those of us, of which I would include myself, who have been very critical of anti-Trump tactics, such as, quote, the resistance, remember that? That's not as popular of a slogan anymore. But it's emblematic of how, contrary to all reason, some of these tactics have been. Resistance, let's recall, was adopted as this radical sounding slogan because it derived from the European anti-Nazi brigades during World War II. So the people who bandied around that label for themselves actually thought, maybe some of them didn't actually think it. I think a portion did genuinely believe this, and a portion were doing it for cynical branding purposes. But nonetheless, they derived that label on the assumption that what the political circumstances in the United States are or were as of 2016 to 2020 were in any way meaningfully comparable to occupied France in like 1942. Give me a break. I shouldn't even have to say give me a break. It should be so blindingly obvious how absurd that is that anybody who's of sound mental capacity ought not need to have that explained to them. But apparently they have. And they've used that as sort of the thematic undercurrent of everything they've done over the course of the Trump presidency. The reason why the tactics they employed were deemed justified is because the threat of Trump was elevated beyond all rationality. And it's not to deny that Trump couldn't arguably pose certain threats. I think he has in some ways. I mean, Julian Assange is sitting in a prison in the UK as opposed to promulgating materials that are pertinent to the presidential race as he did in 2016 because of the actions of the Trump Department of Justice. And I can go on with other examples. But the unending tsunami of hysterics that the anti-Trump opposition wielded, and it was more powerful that, look, when a president is in office, he's always going to have an element of his opposition that is out of their minds. Obama had it. But Trump's opposition was centered in the mainstream of U.S. media and political culture. It didn't emanate from the fringes so much, although there are fringe left-wing elements that converged with the centrist critique of Trump, to their discredit, I would say. But the fact that these power centers of elite opinion were so ruthlessly marshaled against Trump differentiates the nature of his opposition from the opposition that Obama faced and even Bush faced. And you can go back even further. I think there was something incredibly new and novel about the Trump opposition. And if those tactics are perceived to have been vindicated, because remember, all they were about was getting Trump out, impeachment, demands for the 25th Amendment to be invoked. Remember that? And on and on and on. Then the nature of what could be done to dislodge a democratically elected president has radically shifted. And one thing I mentioned in that piece on Medium, which I encourage you to read, is that essentially from the moment Trump took office, what I argued, and this got me denounced by shrieking liberals and leftists as an anti-Trump, or even as a secret pro-Trump, as a fascist, what have you. I argue that Trump ought to be treated with, if you're going to be in opposition to Trump, it should at least be a rational opposition. Like, it should be evidence-based, it should be targeted, it should be substantive, it should not be based on fantasies and delusions, such as he's this Russian agent commanding an army of Nazis or something. Like, that's not a rational interpretation of Trump. And if you believe that, it's not going to be conducive to a rational opposition. And I don't have to tell you that my advice in terms of the rationality that would be beneficial to oppose Trump with, that advice was not heeded. In fact, it was not heeded to such a gargantuan extent that I might as well have been arguing for like the moon to be made out of cheese or something. That's how untenable, apparently, such advice was. And it's not, and that irrationality with which Trump was opposed, it's going to be deemed vindicated if he does lose. And please note that this is not an affirmative case for Trump. I didn't vote for Trump. I didn't vote for Biden. I didn't vote for either. I just think that, those of us who have been repelled by the center left to left delusional mania of the past few years are going to have to try to reconcile with what it means that those manias were actually proven successful should Trump lose, which again is not anywhere near close to a foregone conclusion. So that's the basic premise of the article that I wrote. Take a look, if you so please. And try to stay sane today. I know that's going to be a challenge. I'm not above it all. I'm sure I can get worked up if something happens to excite me in that way. And the trolls are, as always, on the warpath against me. So I react to them in the way that I do. But try to at least maintain some baseline of awareness that so much of the fear stoking and the frenzy promoting that you're going to be engulfed with today is propaganda. It's designed, I don't know how consciously it's designed by its promulgators, but it is by design meant to provoke in you these animalistic tribal impulses. So if you can transcend that, I think you're going to be better off psychologically. Okay, thank you for the super chats. Going to go through a few here. Dylan says, if Trump wins, we can at least look forward to a TYT meltdown. Also, if he does win, which states do you see him taking? I don't know about the TYT meltdown. I guess some people would enjoy that. I don't know that I'd be watching TYT at all, frankly. But more power to them. If Trump does win, which states do you see him taking? Okay, so if Trump does win, I think he's going to have to win unexpectedly, maybe in one or two states. So Nevada is one where I could potentially see him winning in an unexpected fashion. There was a lot of talk about Minnesota earlier in the fall, largely because of the riots that were there. And you don't have to tell me how severe they were. I was in Minneapolis, spent quite a bit of time there documenting the aftermath. Minnesota always seemed like a stretch to me for Trump to win, just because he has high voter engagement already. And I just think a lot of people who were apathetic in 2016 are now, if you were apathetic in 2016 and you're voting now in 2020, let me rephrase. If you were so apathetic in 2016 that you didn't vote, right, but you're now voting in 2020, I think that cross-section of people are probably going to skew Democratic. Like, I think if you were energized about Trump in 2016, you voted for Trump, and now you're still energized. But it's a little bit difficult for me to see, to come up with the type of voter who was apathetic in 2016 and now is pro-Trump. I think they certainly exist. I'm not going to deny that they exist, but I'm saying in terms of the partisan skew, my sense is, and talking to people and looking at some of the polling data, et cetera, that subsection is going to skew Democratic. Although just yesterday I was at the CNN headquarters in downtown Atlanta, which hilariously looks like boarded up ruins because they haven't bothered to fix the smashed windows and stuff from the riots in May and June. And the building has been abandoned, not fully abandoned, but it's not used actively by CNN as its headquarters anymore. And just walking around, a homeless guy came up to me. I asked him, "Hey, are you following the election? Did you vote?" And he's just like, "Yeah, I couldn't vote last time, but I voted this time." I said, "Who'd you vote for?" Well, he said, "Well, I thought about Biden. I haven't been following stuff that closely, and so I just voted for Trump." Like, he didn't even have a rational, an explanation really for why he chose Trump. Just random. So who knows? I'm allowing for randomness in this election cycle to supersede whatever my intuitions are, which is why I'm not giving you an ironclad prediction. I'll say this though: if a miracle happens, a miracle that Democrats have been desperately craving for for a long time, and Texas does vote Democratic, then it's over. It's over pretty much immediately. And look, I don't know what's happening in Texas. People tell me that they're certain that Republicans, that Trump would win. And look, maybe you're right. But when, as of last Friday, more people had voted in total in 2020 before Election Day than had voted in all of 2016, then your certainty at least needs to be dialed down a little bit, because that's a crazy stat. I don't know how to interpret that. And look, we know that the early voters are very much skewing Democratic. That's not to say that there might not be boosted turnout among Republican voters. There may well be. But, the Texas situation in particular gives me pause. And Georgia as well. I mean, one reason why I decided to stay here is because if Trump doesn't win Georgia, then I think it's probably over. And so if I can, bear witness to that, then that would be interesting. On the contrary, if Georgia was not actually competitive at all, and that was just sort of a figment of our imaginations, and the election day turnout is so pro-Trump that it swamps all the early voting stuff completely, then maybe there's some kind of systematic error in how we've been doing this election. Let's see. Caffeine withdrawals. How strong is the crypto shy Trump voter effect this year? I hear a lot of people mentioning that, speculating about that, even just people I know privately. And I don't know. I think that it's bizarre because Trump supporters that I encounter in person and online don't tend to be shy about making it known that they support Trump. And maybe there's some of that. I'm sure there's some of that. I think there's shy people about expressing their political views across the board. I wouldn't discount the possibility that there are shy Biden voters. I mean, maybe you live in a Republican-leaning area and you don't want to tell them that you're voting for Biden. That makes sense because you'll be accused of, promoting communism and riots. So I think that voter effect is a bit overstated, and at the very least, it's not clear which candidate more is benefiting from the shy voter dynamics. I would urge caution about that. Rue King asks a somewhat irrelevant question about Tulsi. I'm sorry, I'm going to pivot from that just to mention that as I tweeted yesterday, Tulsi did put out a final email on the election, and notably, she didn't mention Biden or Trump by name, and she did endorse Biden in March. People are aware of that, but it's funny because thinking back when Tulsi endorsed Biden in March, people use me online as like a proxy to attack her because they associate with her. Okay, fine, but I got berated mercilessly as a means of attacking Tulsi because she had supposedly sold out and abandon her principles or whatever and endorse Biden, even though she said she was going to endorse the Democratic nominee all along. That was no surprise. And a lot of the people who were berating me were Bernie supporters. And I don't know, but Bernie, over the course of these past several months, has been so hyperbolically lecturing everybody that they must support Joe Biden or else civilization will collapse tomorrow. Every single day he does that. He is totally on board with Trump as this world historic menace thesis and has been essentially condemning his own supporters if they don't fall in line and vote for Biden. Whereas all Tulsi did was one time in March of last year say that her personal preference was for Biden as opposed to Trump. She has barely mentioned it, to my knowledge, since then. All she did in this email was to encourage her supporters, to vote according to their principles, which seems perfectly sensible to me. And I do the same. And then I encourage you to vote according to your principles if you really want. But if your principle guides you toward wanting to vote, then do it. But don't feel that you're somehow obligated to vote just because you're constantly propagandized by all these corporations and civic groups and stuff saying that voting is unto itself this wonderfully virtuous act, which I don't think it is. Neon Noir has a somewhat inscrutable comment, so I'm going to skip over that one. I apologize. And look, that'll do it. Final word for now is, again, maintaining sanity ought to be a priority today. Projections of civil war or some kind of nationwide domestic armed insurgency always struck me as overwrought, to say the least. But they are boarding stuff up, so who knows? There could be sporadic incidences of, unrest, let's say. But the idea that it's going to broaden out into some kind of cosmic showdown between the rival sides in American society, I don't think the conditions are such that that's a plausible notion. I did go to Atlanta. I was in Atlanta last night and saw that they had boarded stuff up as precaution, which I guess is rational given the experience of the summer. But it's just bizarre to me that so many people seem to want a civil war. They want an armed insurgency, even though they have nowhere near the personal fortitude or courage or physical ability to actually engage in such a conflict themselves. They just like, BSing about it because it's sort of a fun thing to do online. My sense is that the conclusion of this will be somewhat anticlimactic. Not to say there won't be climactic stuff, right? But I don't think the descent into like anarchy and terror is quite going to arrive in the way that some people bizarrely seem to want. Okay, everybody. Good luck today, I suppose. Stay safe, stay cool, stay sane. That's the most important thing. Bye-bye.